To graph this function, we're first going to look at the zeros. So the zeros are going to be where the x is 0, so that's the x on the outside, and then we have 1 minus x squared. We want to know where that's equal to 0, and that's going to be at plus minus 1. So I've graphed my 3 0 points here. We also have to consider the domain of this function. The square root is going to restrict this domain. At most, at the smallest, it can be -1. So if I put in -2, I get a negative inside the square root. And at most, it can be +1 because if I put in +2, again, I'm going to get negative in the square root. So we have a domain restriction on this graph. So we want to then find the derivative of this function. And by finding the derivative, we're going to be able to find some max min points and fill out our slope chart. So first thing is find the derivative. And using the product rule, I get 1 square root 1 minus x squared plus x. And then differentiating that square root, we get 1 over 2 square root. And then multiply by the derivative of the inside, which is -2x. So I have to watch our signs here. The 2's cancel out. So I'm going to simplify this in a couple steps here. So I'm going to end up with square root 1 minus x squared. We're going to end up with minus x squared over 1 minus x squared, all square root. I want a common denominator here, so I'm going to end up with, that's going to be a minus here, sorry. So I'm going to put it over a common denominator. That means I need another factor of root 1 minus x squared multiplied onto this bracket here, and then that's going to get rid of the square root. So this now simplifies to 1 minus x squared minus x squared all over the common denominator of square root 1 minus x squared. This simplifies to 1 minus 2x squared all over the common denominator 1 minus x squared. Now we have restrictions divide by 0, so at -1 and 1. So if I look at my f prime values, but those are endpoints anyway. So although they're my restricted values of -1 and 1, okay, I have undefined slopes there. That's not going to really affect it, but I do have slopes here. So if I do make this equal to 0 at x equals, when I solve that, I get 1/2 square root, so plus minus 1 over root 2. At those points, I'm going to have min and max points. So that's going to be about 0.707, so -1 over root 2 and +1 over root 2, maybe somewhere around here. Okay, I'm going to get 0 slopes. So checking the slopes, checking my slope chart here, I'm going to use maybe -0.9 as my test point. I plug that in, I'm going to end up with negative in the numerator, and over, that's the denominator has to be positive in that domain. So I get negative slope in here, so it's going to go down. Looks like that might be a minimum, so I'm going to test my slope at 0. So I put 0 into my derivative. I'm going to get +1 in the numerator, and then the denominator is always positive. So that's going to be positive slope through here. That looks like it might be a max. And then we'll test the slope at positive 0.9. And we're going to end up with, again, a negative in the numerator and positive in the denominator. So that's going to give me negative slope through this section here. Okay, so I got a pretty good idea what this graph looks like. I'm going to put in my coordinates. I've got my x-axis coordinates in here. I'm going to plug in -1 over root 2 and +1 over root 2 as well, because those look like my local min and max points. Plugging that into f of x, I get -1 over root 2. When I plug it in inside the square root function, I get 1 over root 2 squared is 1/2. So I end up with 1/2 in the square root, -1 root 1/2 outside the square root. So that's going to be -1/2 as my y coordinate. So at negative 0.707, maybe somewhere around here, I'm going to have a y coordinate at about negative 1/2. So right about there. So that's my negative 1/2. And then positive 1 over root 2, I'm going to end up with, again, square root of 1/2 in the square root part times square root 1/2 for this x here. And that's going to give me square root 1/2 times square root 1/2, which is positive 1/2. Okay, so at this point here, we're going to end up with about 1/2. So 1/2 ends up right about here. Okay, I think I missed that point over here. Maybe just fix that. It's going to 1/2. This looks like it's going to be right about there. Okay, so I have a pretty good idea what this graph looks like now. Based on my slope chart, I can sketch it in. It's going to go to my min point, through the 0, up to the max point, and back down to the end point. Okay, so there is my slope chart. That's what my graph looks like.